Hello, it's The Source Radio. This is day 3 of The Bed Show, the show from my bed in the morning. I mean, there's nothing risque about that. It's just laziness more than anything, and a shot at reality. So let's have a look at some of the feedback that The Bed Show has got online. Now, admittedly, I did post it on a forum not renowned for its members observing the pleasantries and platitudes of polite society. But I wanted to see what people thought, And here are some quotes. I listened exactly 5 minutes in. Very divisive. The rest of the show could have been great. I will never know. Do you know what? I thought that was very unfair until I listened to the show 5 minutes in. I heard myself saying something to the effect of, you've done this to us for years, it's our turn now, and when we come for you, we want your soul. So not the most friendly message to stumble upon when you first tune in, but in context, it was just a bit of friendly joshing. Got to sound less like an embittered Ms. Havisham stroking a dead cat. Another comment, I don't know many intelligent people who read the nonsense the presenter was talking about anyway. Now there, you make an interesting point, What's a good thing to talk about to a population who do buy this stuff, who do read this and are bombarded by pop gruel, whether they actually bought it or not? Because I seem to know everything about light entertainment, and I don't have a TV, and I don't really read the papers. I don't know where it's coming from, but it gets in. So I sometimes think it's a good idea to actually face it head on, and then rip it up, scattering the garish shards back in the faces of the machines that churned it out. Because regarding the headlines, I think it's quite a good idea to make it common practice to employ this Captain Subtext program, which is a piece of software into which you can type a headline and it gives you the plain English version. Because if you make a habit of decoding the headlines in this way, then it becomes second nature and you're less likely to be sucked into reading about whatever crap they're offering. For instance, right? Here's a headline that I think would be interesting to smart and stupid people alike. Today in the papers, what do you think of this? From a jelly bean queen to a monarch made of money, the most unusual portraits made to mark the Diamond Jubilee. Because to me, this seems at first glance like a headline about art. But if you do type that into the translator, what you actually get is, hop aboard the hysteria wagon, the elite are in charge, they've always been in charge, have a day off working to make their money for them, but make sure you worship them during that time we've allowed you, then get back to work. So, I think it's very useful. Another comment on yesterday's show was, it's too womany, and I agree, I wish it wasn't, but it's a horrible reflection of what you find in the papers. And it is boring after a while, so we're going to have to cut down that, because I believe what you resist persists. So if you fight too much for equality as a woman, it's sort of counterproductive. In order to achieve it, you just got to free yourself of the mental enslavement. Because the media is, mentally ill. If this was a person, they would be unhealthily obsessed. If you look at the first few headlines on a very popular news website today, my girlfriend is hot like you. Lewis Hamilton can't tear himself away from Bikini Babe. The next headline, distraught Anne Hathaway sings her heart out as all her hair is hacked off. Lucy Macken, I don't know how to pronounce that, looks hungover and unhappy. Then Jessica Simpson introduces baby to the world, and so it goes on. And it is boring. It is very, very boring. And that's what you're presented with everywhere you look. And also in the media environment, search engines and things, there are often these kind of articles that want to separate the genders and assume we don't really understand each other. There's a guide on Yahoo, what women do that drive men mad. Cushion obsessions. Actually, some of these are quite interesting because I don't understand why the cushion obsession. They're just fat litter, aren't they? Making an anniversary of everything, talking all the time, saying they're fine when they're not. Well, I'll explain that one to you if that is a mystery. A small percentage of men have no emotional intelligence. I'm sure that's the same of women as well. And this whole I'm fine act is a way we can work out just how perceptive a man is. It's a test, I think, designed to see whether or not we can stay with somebody who has that level of emotional understanding. and it's up to you to decipher what really is the problem. But I'm fine. Yeah, it often does mean that there's that we're facing an almost unbearable quagmire. One of my friends, Simon, actually falls at the first hurdle. He doesn't ask enough questions. He asks how you are, but then he stops there. So it leads to scenarios like this. He'd tell me that a mutual friend of ours, Catherine, has had to go to the doctor because she's in agony. And I'll immediately be like, oh my God, what's wrong with her? And although he loves this woman as much as I do, he will just shrug and say, gosh, I didn't ask. I don't know. It genuinely does not occur to him. To him, the emotional terrain of another person is completely uncharted. I mean, he's liable to say things to me like, I don't get it, Kerry, all women are mad. I mean, they cry at weddings, they cry at funerals. There's no rhyme, no reason. I just stay out of it. Although I do have a friend who said that he was like this, but then when he became a father, it all changed. And now he finds himself crying over DIY SOS. Because he's more connected to the world. And also, I don't know, I think it's because of the soundtrack, isn't it? But he feels like he understands the plights of others more than he did before. And if you haven't watched home makeover shows in the UK, by the way, they're often just like cookery shows or talent shows, because where once people would deal with grief privately and lean on friends and families, now people spill their guts right out to an audience of strangers, wailing their misery at the nation that they might have their lounge painted. And I mean, I wouldn't mind if the colours were less garish. Overly dramatic, I think, for a domestic setting would be fair. And I sort of think, so, use your grief, do use it, but use it on one of the others. Use it on the X Factor or on MasterChef, because, you might be more successful as a chef or a singer. As long as you can whistle a tune or cook a souffle, you'd be all right. Okay, so here, instead of decoding another sexist headline, but by Christ, there are a lot of them to choose from, let's try typing this one into the translator and see what it comes up with. Here's a headline from today. Illiterate school leavers and workless households are destabilising the UK economy. And if we type that in, it says, the blame for the country's problems is firmly at your door. It's your fault, not the government's, you stupid, lazy and fat article. Everybody knows you're the reason this country's in a mess, but that's not for here. Why don't you just take responsibility on your own shoulders and stop blaming us? And so the language continues like that into the article with words like idle households and stuff like this. The UK also continues to have a relatively high number of adults with very basic literacy and numeracy skills who are not well placed to benefit from vocational training. All right, so what do they do then? What would you, if you're not going to train them? I mean, that's an incredibly defeatist thing to say. If people can't read, they can learn. You know that? I mean, there are courses for adults who want to improve their literacy or maths or whatever. But to say that if you can't read, you can't benefit from vocational training, that's just wrong anyway. Obviously, it makes life more difficult. But are you suggesting these people shouldn't have courses wasted on them? What about there are manual physical jobs that don't require much reading? There are a lot of jobs, even if they do. If you can manage everyday life like shopping and stuff like that, getting directions, things like that. These things all traditionally require reading. There are people who have dyslexia as well, who wouldn't manage to get anywhere in life if they were discriminated against in this way. But the truth is, people find ways around their deficiencies. We all do. I mean, I've got a problem with reading in that I can read the words. I just don't get the subtleties. I never manage to grasp subtleties when it's sort of in emails and things. I mean, I've literally turned up to 3 job interviews about an hour late because of this. And I got all 3 jobs. So I could obviously do the jobs. But what I'm saying about this article is it points the finger at the illiterate as the cause of the country's problems, not reading back into the fact that it's education that's probably at the cause. I mean, it's a struggle for those facing this. But if it is so widespread, it's not just, say, immigrants who can't speak English or whatever. It's actually education, and that stands to reason. But then you should put that in the headline. Education is to blame. But by saying illiterate people, it sort of engenders a kind of hatred towards those who find themselves discriminated against anyway by a problem that can be difficult to go and get help for because you're embarrassed by it. And then, of course, they're also addressing people who are on benefits and saying these people are to blame, idle households. But then if so many people are better off unemployed than they would be working, make people better off working. It's kind of the government's fault again, isn't it? So it's not actually the end result. It's not the people who are illiterate or who are not working. It's the system. It's that. And that's what should be in the headline, because otherwise you're assigning blame in the wrong place. My parents are really angry with particularly single mothers who stay at home and use benefits in order to bring up children and avoid full-time employment. But actually, there's another argument that children are far worse off and more likely to grow up troubled if they don't get enough attention at home. And in today's society, a lot of families just, parents can't be at home that much because society's set up so that you have to work all the time. So who's worse off? Children who actually get the attention of a parent or who don't, but have material things. And this brings us to another story in the papers today. Children as young as 5 are now being treated for anxiety and depression. And they've given, as an example, an 8-year-old boy who's really afraid of leaving his mum as a sort of typical case. Now, can you relate to that? Because I can. I was really depressed and withdrawn and anxious when I was a child and afraid to be alone, despite being alone a lot of the time, but also afraid to be with other people. And looking back, I wonder if, the really traditional parenting methods would have helped us go. I'm talking about looking back at how, people who live completely natural lives bring up children. As an example, I'm thinking of African tribes or tribes elsewhere who haven't been affected by the Western world. Did you ever read the Continuum concept, the way of raising children that looks at this? I don't even want kids, but I find it fascinating if you're an anxious or depressed adult to look back and decide maybe you learned this behavior as a child and it's not real. It's not in response to any real danger. It's just become a habit. When I read this book, it talks about tribes in Africa where the babies, they're just strapped onto their mother's backs all the time. So clamped onto her, she goes to work just as normal. And it shows how this combination of being physically close and available to the child, but not pandering to their whims all the time, because actually they don't act up to get your attention when they're with you. So it shows how that kind of environment leads a child to be naturally secure. And at some point they get tired of being clamped to their mother and, being able to sleep in the same bed as their parents. And they decide they want to break away at a certain point. And it's when the time's right for them. And then they're not afraid of their freedom because they've got the kind of self-assurance that other children can lack because they made the break for it. I find this really interesting. I know one thing, obviously, if you're not a parent, you're not allowed to judge them in any small way at all. Louis C.K., I think, was the one who said that he used to see parents in supermarkets or a lone parent, just sitting with their kid eating junk food in some restaurant and all shopping bags strewn around just with their head in their hands, inattentive, exhausted. And he used to think, when I have children, I will not be that kind of parent. And now that he has them, he just looks at that kind of sight and thinks, what did that brat do to that poor woman, that poor lady? She looks like such a lovely person. What's she done to deserve this? So I wouldn't try to judge people. I just think the fact that our kids are more depressed now is a sign. It's another call for us to look at probably ways of changing workplaces to better accommodate family life. I see it happening with us being able to work in a more flexible way. But I think the solution would be when people who work part-time can actually still progress into the top jobs and make a reasonable living. Because at the moment, if you want to be promoted, you're not likely to get it if you're part-time, But that, I think, is not an immovable obstacle because it's surely just a social construct. If we've built every business around a 5-day-a-week paradigm, we're not using all the days now. Surely we could cut it back even further. We could build another paradigm around, say, a 3-day-a-week model. And it's just a case of wanting it badly enough. Perhaps when society realizes how much the next generation is suffering, they'll start looking at how they can do that. The fear, of course, is that it's probably going to have to be the next generation who implements it. And they're the new people coming to the workplace. But how on earth are we going to how on earth are they going to do that if they're badly equipped in terms of literacy skills from poor education, if they're brainwashed, terrified, unrealistically aspirational from the obscenities that we've fired at them from the media we allowed? We've left them undernourished and completely ignorant about health from the GM cardboard frankenfoods we did nothing to stop and in fact encouraged. They're jobless, broke, without any real hope for the future from the economic problems our generation's caused, unable to better themselves without getting themselves into mortgage-style debts from the higher education system we've managed to sleepwalk into, coupled with the fact that the debt of a real mortgage is now too much for your average person to apply for until they're in their late 30s or early 40s. How is anyone going to secure a home for themselves in this way and therefore be able to feel they're ready to start a family if they still feel insecure in themselves? So when young people at the age of 5 or 6 get anxious, you know what? It's good practice for what their lives are going to be like. And they probably wouldn't even manage to have kids, because who in the world is going to manage to become pregnant when they've grown up with an internet that makes them think sex is about a woman kneeling in front of 5 love-starved, fossilized casualties animated by the feel of mutated lust and self-loathing? You know, sex is just bizarre nowadays, worthy of shame, isn't it? That's what people associate with it, I think, because of what the internet's like. And I remember even years ago, Frank Zappa saying that it's something people don't understand. Sex doesn't exist, only titillation exists. And I think a lot of that comes from the fact that love, in a way, loses its meaning if it's just the facade that people wear to get other people to do things, you know, because if you see somebody smile in a supermarket at you, say in America where service is very good, we in Britain think the Americans are such lovely people, they're so friendly. But actually, I'd be interested to hear what you think if you're listening in America. To me, it seems that, yeah, it's a much nicer shopping experience, but that interest in shops is paid for by CEOs. It's money in motion. I tell you what, though, I don't care if it's the painted facade of capitalism. I'd much rather have that kind of service than the kind of thing you get in British shops where you buy some item from a little shop and you don't get told how much you owe the guy behind the counter. You just get an impatient hand thrust in your face while the other hand straps a mobile to his shouty head. That is the British experience. But sometimes they take a prurient interest in your life and invite you to a boat party somewhere in Canary Wharf, and then you're thinking, I'd kind of like to go to that, but you know, maybe it is worth the risk of waking up in a ditch 2 days later with a stranger's. Yeah. Anyway, one thing capitalism will pay us to do over here in Britain is shift work, and a lot of people use that as a kind of sort of flexible working life, although it's a false economy because you do have to sleep. It doesn't mean you work any less, but this might be why we're not as polite as Americans, because of course charm is the first casualty of sleep deprivation. But there's an article today that says shift work increases your risk of breast cancer in particular and other serious health problems too. But I wonder, is this actually accurate? Because it could be a number of other factors. You know, shift work could be the kind of work that's lower paid, lower skilled jobs, and therefore people are maybe living a less healthy lifestyle in general because people who earn less eat less healthily. Or is it actually just the fact that you've got to stay in tune with the circadian rhythms? You've got to sleep when it's dark, you know? Is sunlight really that important? If you're interested in the low-fat, raw vegan lifestyle, there's a really heavy emphasis on getting enough sleep and getting enough sun. And since we're not nocturnal creatures, it does seem to make sense. And I know that people in Scotland who I went to school with have struggled with a lack of vitamin D, which you don't really hear of in England as a common kind of problem, but it apparently causes things like depression and, of course, in my mum's day, bone problems, all kinds of things. So I can believe that working shifts could be bad. Well, the one thing that makes me doubt it at all is the fact that I used to work shifts and everyone in that workplace looked unfeasibly young. It was people used to say their age and be really proud of it because you'd be surprised by how old they were. So that baffles me, because it was a job in radio. There's loads of stress, the odd fight, and people were under tremendous pressure. But I could just remember everyone looked so young. It must have been because they literally never saw the sun at all. Could have been that. There's another story here about how the EU is bringing in stricter guidelines for pilots, though, after 43% admitted to falling asleep involuntarily at some point whilst on duty. So that's a bit, for the love of God, if there's one person you don't want to fall asleep, it's a pilot. And of course, the continual battle for better working conditions persists in almost every workplace. Doctors have just voted in favour of industrial action to change their pensions, for changes proposed to their pensions. Yeah, good luck with that protest, love. No one's going to be able to read the writing on your placards, are they? Unless they're a chemist. So I hope it's an attentive crowd. When I see people protesting for better work conditions, whether it's like post office workers, people on the underground, or doctors or media people, my first instinct used to be, even if it affected me, was just, look, it's not that bad. We're not in a third world country. We're not going to starve. But then you've got to realise it's all just a necessary process of haggling. When new pensions are suggested, they probably factor in a margin for the workers to haggle you down a bit. So really, if this happens, I suppose you can't afford to roll over when you're presented with cuts. You'd feel later that you'd been shortchanged. So it's probably less about people being unwilling to take their share of responsibility for the new need for austerity, and more about them realising there's just, some necessary haggling to be done here. So we'll settle for it later. I don't know, maybe you disagree. Tell me what you think. With regard to the incoming workforce, students, the government has rejected claims that the crackdown on immigration could harm British universities and the economy by stopping the brightest students from coming here. When I was at Sussex University 10 years ago, I wish there were fewer bright students from abroad, because I was studying music where I must admit I didn't have a single grade and couldn't play an instrument or read music. And but in my year, the foreign students, the ones from Germany and Spain and France, were just amazingly talented, and amazingly experienced when it came to performing. I was so bad at sight reading. Please don't tell my parents. I couldn't really read music at all. So I listened at the door of the recital room for my sight reading exam. I listened to the student before me and just played the piece he played when I went in. And the lecturer had to stop me and say, well, that's very accurate, but it's a different piece, Kerry. There's a different piece of music. Look, I think we better have a chat, don't you? Because, it was quite a different piece. And if you can't even tell the music in front of you is starkly different from the one that the guy before played, it's pretty bad. But that's why I say, if you can't read, it doesn't mean that you can't fake it in life. You do find strategies. This point has been very badly illustrated with my tale there of an epic educational fail. But the point is, I could never read music, but I learned to just play anything by ear. No one would ever know that I couldn't read music. Got a degree. Well, provided they didn't realise the score in front of me was something completely different. Anyway, if you can't read or you can't do maths, I think you find ways that you can cope. Of course, literacy is the thing that you think could be easily transferred onto the young, given that we do live in a first world country. But I just think that, with class sizes getting bigger and children playing truant, whereas in other countries where education is harder to get, children are literally breaking into schools. It's a really difficult job to teach anyone anything. MPs are now recommending that all school children should take compulsory self-esteem lessons. And I think that sounds like quite a good idea. I wonder if that's part of the answer to the problems that young people face, because the media is so aspirational that it can make you feel like a complete nobody unless you have a car and an entourage and a vajazzle. God, I wish I was joking. It's conveyed in the media by some as a must-have. I'm not joking. If you don't know what it is, please don't look it up. You will, part of you will die if you find out what it is. So self-esteem lessons may stamp out that phenomenon slightly. The problem, I think, would just be finding teachers who have enough self-esteem to be able to take these classes convincingly. because I think what they have to put up with nowadays, it must be a struggle. Another thing the self-esteem lessons would help young people with, I think, and I'm sorry to come back to gender, but it might help them with body image, because it says here that half of the UK suffers from poor body image, with girls as young as 5 worrying about their appearance. Now, I could easily return to the point that on the front page of most of the popular papers in the UK, there will always be several reasons why this is, but I won't. It just brings me back to this radio station, the Source Radio, because it's this is why we've set it up. We're a bunch of presenters initially, and we want lots of different people to get involved. But we found in commercial radio, it's hard to have a proper conversation when your sponsors are people that you could upset with what you say, and then you wouldn't have a platform at all because they would pull out, you know. And you think of sponsors as drinks companies, snack foods, I don't know, the odd website, local estate agent, stuff like that. The kind of thing I encountered working commercial radio were companies so massive, we're talking multinational mega conglomerates, that if there was a story in the news about protesters campaigning against capitalism itself, the sponsors would say, by no means take part in that debate, because they embody capitalism so much. That's how difficult free speech can be sometimes. That is an extreme case. On a lot of local stations I've worked at, as long as you don't discourage people from frequenting the local ice rink, you'll be all right. But the Source Radio is designed as a place where you'll hopefully be able to hear the alternative viewpoint on things. And that's not to say the lefty viewpoint. We want to create a platform where people with ideas on how to improve society can put those forward. And at this point, I'm thinking if we ever made any money from it, the content would immediately be compromised, wouldn't it? I don't know. I think that's the case. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens. At this stage, we're just starting it up. So we want contributors and ideas for content, podcasts that you habitually listen to that you think might want a rebroadcast in the UK, or you think other people might like, and ideas for output in general. I believe this kind of thing has its roots in the audience itself. So the people who set it up can't have too predefined an idea about how it's going to be. You have to, as it were, forgive me for like using this term, you have to like feel the shape of it as it emerges, because the motive here is way more important than money. As I say, I don't think it's compatible with money. The motive is for people to listen to new ideas, for people to be interested in engaging content that does require them to think. A lot of content doesn't, of course. And for people to turn away from that mind-rotting bait that some media companies use to get your attention, purely to sell you on to their advertisers. So you see, you're the product in that equation. You're the product. It's not the content that is. The content is just the bait to keep your mind occupied. Anyway, the Bed Show is back on Tuesday because this whole Jubilee thing gives us a good opportunity in London to shut ourselves away from the outside world and huddle in a dark room and do all the music branding for this station. Don't worry, it won't be like the other ones. It's going to be even more grandiose. It's my plan to write this stuff for a 90-piece orchestra, just because you can nowadays, and inflate it to a giant pufferfish of a thing, drunk on a sense of its own importance, but just for a bit of a laugh, you know. We'll pop it again with the pin of irony. Anyway, I'll see you next week. Have a good day.